And then I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
And we are going to talk about caring for hot crops. And with that, Akello, take it away.
All right. Thank you for the, and I'm gonna just do a sound check real quick. Can you hear me well, Keto?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for the introductions, and thank you all for joining our class this evening. Today, we're going to be talking about the crops that we're going to be giving out through the hot crop distribution, making sure that you all have the know-how and the understandings on how to get these transplants and seeds to produce for you and do well in your garden. So let's do the next slide, please, Keto. Okay. So we did have a class on our co-crops last month or so, Keto. And if you all have any questions regarding your co-crops, please check out that YouTube video. Keto, if you can put the link in there for that, that would help out some people. But today we're going to be talking about our hot crops, which we're going to be beginning distributing May 17th. And so here's a list of our crops. You all should have this in your email. It's also here for you to see. Next slide, please, Keto. And we'll be talking about each and every one of these crops. Yeah. Well, one thing that I'm just forgetting that we don't have on this list is our onions and potatoes, Keto. But we can have a conversation about that as well.
It's on the left.
I mean, in terms of things in the slide.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, for sure.
Okay. And Keto, for me, if you could pull up our one pager on the onions and potatoes, that would help too.
Okay. Let me just technically really can we just try something really quick? If I go, if I do that, does that affect your screen? Do you still see the slides?
I still see the slides.
Okay. Yeah. So I just need to know that I just want to make sure I can move around my computer and still, you can still do what you're doing.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So in this distribution, we have a plethora of crops that we're giving out. Some typical old favorites and some new things, like we're bringing back red burgundy okra, and we still have our favorite Cherokee purple and big beef tomatoes. Next slide, please, Keto. But so you guys are going to be receiving your transplants and seeds. Make sure that your garden has enough light for your plants to grow. Vegetables prefer 8 to 10 hours of sunlight, and they also need nighttime light as well, but that is a given. Make sure that your garden gets watered at least 1 to 2 times a week. And please use the recommended spacings that are provided in your Plan Your Garden sheet. And then I also want to add that with your transplants that you harden off your transplants. And hardening off is the process of introducing your plants to the elements instead of just, instantly planting them outside as soon as you get them from us. So give them about a week to get used to the outside. So that will look like putting them outside during the day and then bringing them outside at nighttime. And you want to repeat that for 7 days, okay? And also spend some time in your garden. You might not have time to, work in your garden every single day, but at least go through, do a walkthrough, maybe take some notes of work that you need to do in your garden. So that comes Sunday or whichever day you have time to work in your garden, you can be efficient. And while you're out there taking some notes, maybe do some weeding because weeds can Weeds are more, they're more used to this, the soil, they're more used to this land, thus they can outcompete your vegetable plants, which are, somewhat foreign to where you're planting them. And so because of that, weeds can compromise the healthier plants by simply outcompeting them. And so you want to make sure that you're staying on top of your weeds until your plants or seeds that you're seeding are big enough to compete or outcompete those weeds. All right, next slide, please. All right, so our hot weather crops. Hot weather crops are plants that can't really tolerate frost, so they don't really like to be anywhere below 50 degrees consistently. And for Michigan's climate, we can expect our last frost to happen somewhere between May 1st and May 30th. So that's why, we're still experiencing some cold weather, so we can have our break anytime between May 1st and May 30th. So a pretty safe, consistent temperature is when it's consistently going to be, at least above 50, for about, gone past some, at least over 50 for about a week. And once you have that clear, where it's not going to get somewhere around 40 or 30, you're clear to definitely plant your plants. And yeah, typically seeds like to be planted, hot crop seeds like to be planted in soil temperatures that are, at least above 65 degrees so that they can germinate well and on time. All right, so here's a list of the plants that we're going to be talking about today and that you all will be getting from our hot crop distribution. And this is also has been emailed to you all as well. So another thing that you all should have received is our Plan Your Garden document. On the second page of it, it lists the plant spacings, the recommended plant spacings for the vegetables and fruiting crops that we're giving out. So it's separated by seeds and by transplants. This one also includes our hot crop and co-crop and some fall crop plants. On the right of this list, the harvest times for those crops. And let's just take one for example to work with through it. So we have, let's start at the top, arugula. Well, let's do something specific to hot crop.
Oh, hold on, sorry.
All good. So just to help you all understand this sheet, so let's look at our whole beans and our bush beans. Those crops are very similar. When you plant them, you can expect to have in harvest somewhere between 50 days. And then for our recommended spacing is 3 inches apart. And so let's say if you planted your beans somewhere in late May, you should expect to get your harvest somewhere between June and July. I'm actually looking at that, and that might be something we might have to fix. So if you go down to tomatoes as well, it's the same thing. So tomatoes, it would be a 75 days to harvest, and we recommend about 2 feet between each tomato. And if you get your tomatoes in May, you should be expecting harvest late June, July, all the way through August. Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking at that sheet wrong. Sorry, everybody. This is the ideal plant times for outdoors, not the harvest times. So these are the months that you can plant your crops. So that's why I was looking at it like, oh, this is something else. So tomatoes, you're safe to plant your tomatoes in May and in June, and then you'll have a harvest, afterward. So these are all planting.
60, yeah, like you're saying 65 days later. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm like, I'm trying to remember what we did. So these are like safe planting periods for all of these crops here, okay? All right, next slide, please. All right, so let's get into the bulk of things. So what I want people to be able to take away and how I'm going to be structuring when I'm going to be talking about with the plants. I'm going to go from, spacing to maintenance to harvest, talking a bit about pests and diseases and some post-harvest things, and also some seed saving as well. Okay, so those would be the main topics I'll be covering. And so we have our hot crops, our squash, our cucurbits. We have Hubbard Squash, which is in the picture right here. That's the red curry Hubbard Squash. We have butternut. And the Hubbard Squash and the butternut are winter squash. And we also have delicata, which we are giving out. The zucchini and the yellow squash are summer squash. And so you have your winter squash and your summer squash. That just means that you'll be harvesting those winter squash during the winter period. So October, November, that's when you'll be harvesting those crops. And then for your summer crops, you'll be harvesting those during the summer. And summer crops, they're harvested when they're younger. Winter crops, they're harvested when they're a bit older. And these are.
Can you elaborate on that, on what that means, like younger or older?
Younger and older, meaning that, we plant our summer squash sometime in June and also our winter squash in June, but you're going to be harvesting your summer squash during the summer. But your winter squash, you're going to be harvesting that during the winter. Thus, the summer squash are younger and the winter squash a bit older.
Right. And also, I mean, can I just add that, like, the immature, basically summer squashes we're harvesting them when they are immature fruits, kind of relating to what you're talking about in terms of seeds. Like they are when we harvest them, the seeds inside them are not mature yet. Whereas the winter squash types, we're letting those go all the way into the plant almost all dies back and those seeds are fully mature inside of them. That's just another kind of thing to know about in terms of the plant biology.
And we'll talk about that more when we go into my point about seed saving for them. But for planting and spacing, in your planting instruction hot crop document, which we give out with each of the distros, we have a overview over transplanting and how to plant transplants and seeds. And so that will be sent to you all out in an email. And so I'll just say for now, our plant spacing for our squashes are generally going to be recommended at 2 feet between each. And when you plant them, we recommend that you plant them 1 to 2 seeds and that you mound the soil around your transplants to elevate it them a little bit. And I'll just draw what that will look like if I have my marker. So you guys, so when you're mounding your plants, you want to kind of make a mound that's about this size, and then you're gonna put your seed in that. You kind of want to make it look like a bit of a volcano a little bit, so that when you water, your water's gonna catch here with your seeds. And you want to plant your seeds down just a little bit. So that's what your mound would just kind of look like.
How deep are the seeds?
I would only plant the seeds about 1 inch deep.
And okay. Yeah. So the mound, how high would the mound be?
I wouldn't make it a bit too high, probably no more than about 6 inches above what the ground is. And from there, you want to make sure that your plants are getting about 1 inch of water each week. And so what that can look like, to give you some real context on what that might look like, when you're watering, you want to make sure that you water so that the soil is generally saturated. And when you know that it's saturated, you know this, you check this by sticking your finger inside the soil. And when you pull out your finger should be covered in soil and it should feel somewhat wet. And you should feel that deep down where the seed is around. And that's how you make sure that you're watering correctly. You want to make sure that, how's my audio, Keto?
It's okay for me.
Okay. I'll talk slower. When you're watering your plants, you want to stick your finger down, somewhere a little bit away from it, because you would know you want to water directly on the seed. Check probably a couple of inches away, and if your finger is wet from that, then you know that your seed is wet from that and well saturated, and that's how you know if you're watering it generously each week. The older and the bigger the plant is, the more water that it's going to need per week. So like if you're just planting a seed, at that stage of it, you won't need a lot of water. You just need to make sure that you're getting that seed wet and the soil around it moist. And then as the plant gets older, that's when it's going to start to need, more water. And so you want to be able to gauge and properly water your plant at certain stages of its life. All right. And so squash are, pretty low maintenance plants once they get going. Things that you do want to look out for while they're growing is downy mildew and powdery mildew. These are fungi that pop up, and they're from soil-borne fungus. And you can go to the next slide to show them pictures of it, Keto. These are soil-borne fungus, and to properly address these, a plant can survive and still produce while they still have powdery mildew, but you want to note that powdery mildew is a soil-borne fungus, meaning that if you leave that plant there, it's a possibility that it would live within your soil. So you do want to practice things like crop rotation, so that you're moving your squash plants to different areas of your garden or farm, so that the soil-borne, so that the fungus doesn't have a host that it can reproduce with. And also at the end of the season, you want to make sure that you're taking your plants and putting them in your compost pile, or burning them, or disposing of them, because the fungi can still live in that plant material. One thing that you can also do while your plant is growing is cutting off those infected leaves, just some of them, not all of them. You still want to leave plants for your plants to photosynthesize and such. And also an important note, for your powdery mildew, and I'm gonna cover up the chat. An important note for your powdery mildew when you're harvesting. So let's say you got powdery mildew on your squash plant over in this raised bed, and then you got some that don't have it in a different raised bed. When you're harvesting and working with their plant, you want to make sure that you're working with an infected one first, and then working with the infected one, and not crossing between those, because you would turn into a vector and just be passing that fungus to your next plant.
And that would relate to other things in the family too, yeah?
Yes, so pretty much all cucurbits, which are watermelon, winter squash, summer squash, all of those are susceptible to the same type of powdery mildew. An important note for fungi, the powdery mildew for a tomato plant will be different for a powdery mildew for a for a cucurbit plant, but you do want to practice those big practices with diseases, with fungi, and also not harvesting or working with your plants that are infected during the when it's wet. And so that will also make it so that, you know, the powders are even more stickier. Now, some foundational things that you can do to prevent and also help your plant, you know, fight through this infection. Simple things that you can do. Make sure that there's airflow for your plant. So that might mean that you're going to trellis your cucurbits so that more air can, you know, get on them and so that they can dry out faster. And also make sure that you're watering directly to the soil and where those roots are, and not just watering the leaves of the plant. You know, there's no purpose in watering the leaves of the plant. You're only gonna make it more wet and make it easier for that fungi to stick onto that plant. Another thing that you can also do is, and this is a foundational and also remedial thing that you can do as well. Spraying neem oil on your plant's leaves can also help reduce the attack the powdery mildew, the fungi, and also copper fungicide is also something that you can put on top of your plants. But it's important that you do those foundational easy things of watering correctly and making sure your plants have airflow and are spaced apart from each other. You know, if it's not looking too good, then I'd say, you know, invest or, you know, use those things of the copper fungicide and the and the neem oil. Can you go to the previous slide, Keto?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Anything else? Oh, sorry, I pressed a button on my computer. Let's talk about. Oh.
Before you go on, can I just address a few questions?
Yeah.
So there's a few questions about, is there anything preventatively you can do for powdery mildew? And
Yeah.
then also afterwards, can you know, the question is the soil still able to be used if your squash had powdery mildew?
So preventative, you want to manage your watering and airflow. And preventative, you can also, you know, start spraying neem oil on them probably once a week or so, and also the copper applications. Those are things you can do before and after, okay? And then your soil, if your soil already had the powdery mildew in there, I mean, you can still use that plant. I mean, it really all depends on the health of the plant. If you're in that position where you have powdery mildew, I recommend that in your soil already and you have to plant, you know, your squash right there. If you don't have space to do a crop rotation, I recommend that you know, do those practices, but also add in some compost to your soil. Compost has a lot of beneficial microbes, which can help, you know, prevent that powdery mildew from being as bad as it could be, okay? But definitely important, make sure watering correctly and your airflow is there, and that you're not harvesting or, you know, messing with that plant when it's wet and infecting other plants by working with it in the rain. Let's talk harvest. So once your plant starts to produce, so let's talk about summer squash harvest. And Keto, let me know if I'm spending, you know, too much time, you know.
Okay. No, you're doing great.
Yeah.
But I'll give you, I mean, yeah, we got a little time yet, but
Yeah.
I'll give you maybe give you a question in a minute.
Okay. Harvest. So with your summer squash, like yellow squash and zucchini, your harvest are going to be based on the size of that plant. And so once it's the length of, 6 to a foot, 6 inches is kind of like the standard. That's when you want to harvest your plant. And in terms of materials, you want to use like a scissor or knife or some clippers to correctly harvest that plant so that you're not pulling or damaging the vines of that plant. And they're also kind of spiky some, so you might want to wear some gloves while you're harvesting. And then when you're harvesting, if you look here at the red Hubbard squash, you see that brown part right on top. You want to cut and you want to leave on a summer squash, that part is going to be green, and you want to still have that part left on that squash when you cut it off, because that's going to help preserve the health and the life of that plant while it's off the vine. If you break off that piece or cut off that piece, your squash isn't going to last it as long inside of the refrigerator or such. Now with winter squash, like the red curdy and the Hubbard squash, you're going to be looking to harvest these crops sometime during the winter period, so October, November, and you'll start to see with the Hubbard squash that it kind of turns tan. When they're growing up, they're going to be a little green, kind of light looking, but they're going to turn a little bit of a tan color as they get more mature. And then you want to harvest them in the same fashion with some clippers, cut off right just above that brown tip. Same thing for the red curdy squash. And then the winter squash need to go through a curing process, which converts the sugars within the squash to make it taste more, a lot better. And that curing process just looks like leaving it where sun can hit it. And you want to do that for about a week. And then you want to flip it over to the other side. Let it sit in the sun for about a couple of days and then flip it over to the other side and let it cure for about a week. And then you're able to store that crop or use that crop as you please. And
those winter squashes are like, storage a bit. You can put them in the root cellar, right?
Yes, so they have to, it's recommended that they go through the curing process before you store them.
And how long will some of those winter squashes keep?
Those can keep for about 3 to 5 months, depending on how they're stored. And that is pretty much a cool, dark place. You don't have to put them in the fridge. They can sit out someplace where there's no sunlight and the temperature is somewhat, room temperature. With seed saving for the summer squash, you want to, even though they're like inches, you're gonna let them just grow, let them just stay in there probably, for the majority of summer. And once that plant gets about a foot long and you can kind of see that it's starting to change color some, that's when the seeds inside are ready. And then you can just scoop in and then those seeds are ready to go. With squash, they don't need to go through a curing process. And we'll talk about that with tomatoes. Once they're fully developed, they're ready for storing. And then with winter squash, once you wait until October, November, those seeds are ready to go as well. All right. And then there is a question about the milk and the baking soda. So those things are also things that can be used for the fungi, the powdery mildew and downy mildew, things that you can apply on your plant to deter that. Let's move on to the next slide. Borers. Squash vine borers. All right. Another cucurbits, and I'm gonna. These are, basically the same, the same practices as the last cucurbits that we talked about, cucumbers. So pretty much the same mounting practice, about 18 inches apart from each one. You want to definitely make sure that you trellis your cucumbers. It's going to make it a lot easier for them to be managed and also control diseases better. With harvesting, the size is going to be based on, really what you like. With the slicing cucumbers, about 6 inches again, and the pickling ones can be harvested when they're a little bit smaller. Probably about 3 to 4 inches for the pickling ones. And with seed saving, it's going to be the same process with summer squash, just letting them stay a little bit longer. If you let them stay a little bit longer on the vine, it's important that you let them stay on the vine and develop more for seed saving. They're going to start to turn yellow, and that means that the seeds are going to be ready for seed saving. So same practices with powdery mildew management or fungi management. Let's talk about the cucurbit beetles and some pests and spider mites. So let's start with spider mites. Spider mites are a type of mite that you will see, and it will kind of have little spider webs that will be on the leaves of your tomato plant. You will normally see spider mites inside a greenhouse setting or someplace where it's inside, where there's not rain. They really don't like to be rained on. Thus, if you have an issue with spider mites, getting your, and this is for like an inside setting, kind of spraying them down with water or applying neem oil on top of where those spider mites are a good way to handle those. The cucumber beetle. The cucumber beetle is one that's a bit more trickier to manage simply because it flies. And it is a plant, insect that overwinters inside of the debris of your cucumber plants or cucurbit plants. And so what you want to do is make sure that you're, at the end of the season, make sure that you're cleaning up your cucumber debris and either composting it or burning it or such, so that you're not leaving a home for those cucumber beetles. And then I saw a comment about the mites, the boar mites. With those, you want to make sure that you're
Verified squash vine borer, is that what you're talking about?
yes, in the comment. You want to identify it, find where they are, cut them out if you can. And one thing that, if you're really having trouble with these pests, and this is something that I sent you in a comment, Keto, the Dinotomatillos powder, the insecticide powder. This is a powder that you would put on top of your plant, and it affects those insects that have an exoskeleton. And so that powder gets inside of them, and it's really spiky. It's like as sharp as a diamond to these insects. And so when they walk on top of your plant, go and eat your plant, they're cutting themselves, and it takes about 48 hours for that to affect that plant. And so this is also a solution, a kind of a the last step solution for flea beetles as well. And I say a last step solution because it's a broad spectrum insecticide, meaning that it kills and it affects a lot of insects, not just the ones that you're putting it down for. So it's important that you use that, in certain spaces and not all over the garden, because you'll be affecting a lot of the insect life. So let's go down to the next slide. Watermelon. I'm gonna go through this a little bit more quickly. Watermelon just requires, a lot more space. I would recommend about 2 feet spacing between those, and also them as well.
You're getting a little muffled there.
Oh, getting a little muffled. Okay. Also, there's somebody in the background with the sound on.
Okay. Can everybody mute themselves?
All right, thank you. All right. So, watermelon, it's very close to the same practices of growing as the as a summer squash. They just take a little bit longer to grow, particularly with, and I do like this note about the management of hiding your watermelons in straw to keep them away from the pests. That's very ingenious. And that's something you can do to protect your melons. And a big question about when your melons are going to be ready. So my favorite way and my most go-to and consistent way of making sure my watermelons are ready are by checking the tendon, the curly tendon that's closest to my watermelon. And usually that's growing alongside your melon, so it's not too far off. There, it's like you got your melon and then how it's connected to the plant, and then you'll see your little curly tendon just a little bit away from it. And on the same vine. And that tendon will be green. And if it's green, that's mean that you'll kind of see a bit of an immature melon. And then as that tendon turns brown, that means that your melon is also becoming, ripe and ready for harvest. And so when that tendon is completely browned and dried out, that means that it's time to harvest your melon. And melons don't need to go through a curing process at all. There are other methods of, checking if your melon is ripe. You can do the thump test, hearing for that good sound, and also flipping it over and looking at the, seeing how that yellow spot under it looks. If the yellow is really deep, that's also a good sign. So I like to use that as well in combination with the checking the tendon and also looking over at the yellow side. The thumping hasn't really worked for me. But, and there's also a note of, that's okay. Another thing that you can use with your cucurbits are the squash blossoms. Those are also edible as well. And you see those for sale at the markets all the time. The harvest method for that is just, cutting it at the tip, and then you just have to be careful with how you handle it because it's a flower.
A Kello question, I didn't address this earlier, but there was a question about, there was on one of the slides there, it said in terms of treating the powdery mildew or such, why using milk or baking soda. Can you speak to those?
Oh, yeah. I did mention that. It's just another method that you can use applying baking soda on top of the powdery mildew where those leaves are, and also applying the milk in the same type of way. So those are listed as other options along with the neem oil that you can use for those mildews.
I'm sorry, I was distracted, I guess.
All right.
Ready to move on?
Slide. Yep. All right. So I'll just mention again, the cucumber beetles, that diatomaceous insecticidal powder, if you can't pronounce that like me, the insecticidal powder is a really broad spectrum thing that you can apply to your plants that will really take care of your also Japanese beetles, your tomato, your potato beetles and cucumber beetles as well. But it's kind of a last option thing since it does affect a lot more insects as well. Next slide, please. All right, so the beans are, really straightforward, easy crops to do, and they're super delicious as well. Beans. So beans can be planted in seeds that are 4 to 6 inches apart, in rows that are 18 inches apart as well. I like to seed 1 to 2, 2 to 3 beans per spacing apart, just to make sure that the germination is well. One thing that I forgot to mention is soaking your seeds overnight before you go out and plant them. It's just gonna, quicken the time of germination if you soak those big seeds. So like your beans and your cucurbit seeds, those are excellent seeds that you should soak before you go out and plant them. You will see germination rates increase, and the speed of germination increase. Germination being the emergence of that seedling from the seed. So you
How long do you soak them for?
I soak those big seeds, so like the watermelon, the butternut squash, the black-eyed pea, the pole beans, soak those overnight, so no more than like 24 hours or so.
Okay. And that's a bonus, but you don't have to. It helps, but you don't.
Bonus, but you don't have to. So it's basically, you plant your seed and you go out and water it, but then you might not water your seed again, until you get to it again. If you soak them, you're giving them that water that they need to emerge a lot efficiently, more efficiently. But if you are just going to plant your plant directly inside of the soil, you want to make sure that you're checking it and watering it, at least every 1 to 2 days until that seed emerges. And so that because you don't want your seed to dry out during that period. Yeah. So with your pole beans, you want to make sure that you trellis them, and with your, let me get back on track. Some of our beans have different days to harvest. Black-eyed peas are going to be a 60-day, and then our dry beans are going to be a 90-day. And so let me explain that. So there are those beans that you can eat fresh, which we're calling the 60-day beans. And then if you want a dry bean, like your black-eyed peas for your black-eyed pea soups, then you would let those beans dry out on the vine instead of harvesting them when they're ready. So picture your pole beans being trellised, and when you're trellising them, you want them to at least come up to your waist length, to be about like 4 inches or above the ground, so that your plant has a length to grow up on, and so that they're also supported. Beans. So let me take a moment. So when you're harvesting your beans, you want to harvest them at a particular period where the bean is somewhat still straight and it's longer than 3 inches, or excuse me, longer than your finger. That's something that you can go by, which is easy to relate to and work with. Longer than or somewhat as long as your finger, and that's pretty much the ideal size when it's still skinny, but still longer than your finger. If you see that your bean is starting to develop bumps, that means that the seeds are starting to develop more. That means that the bean, taste-wise and also texture-wise, is going to be a bit more crunchier and not as pleasant to eat. So if you're harvesting beans for or green beans, you want to harvest them before they get to that bumpy stage. And then if you're harvesting beans for dry beans, doing some seed saving, you're just going to leave them on the vine, let that bean plant grow as many as it likes until they dry out, when the plant dies out as well. And then you would just come through and harvest all of those dry beans. And then you would have to do a threshing process where you're, getting that husk off of those beans, meaning that you're kind of crushing them up some and trying to figure out how to go through this entire process. But basically, you're just going to dehusk those plants. And if you're at a home garden scale, you can take the time to dehusk those individually, or you can put them on a table and put them in a bag and just crush them up and then shake them out, and you have your seeds at the bottom. There's tons of information on how to dehusk your beans or thresh your beans. Let's see. In terms of pests, there aren't really any common issues that I find with beans. Nothing that's too annoying. One thing that you will commonly see is rust, where it looks exactly like rust on top of your beans, where it might be some type of soil-borne fungus. That can just typically happen just from beans being on the ground. In terms of how edible that is, all you have to do is just cut off that piece and it's still, good to eat. Something that's not a huge issue with beans. But beans are a very easy, straightforward crop. Trellis them if they need to be trellised, and do proper spacing with them. With beans, you do want to kind of check on their harvest. Check on them at least every 3 days, because they do grow fast when they're in their peak season. And when you're planting your beans, I also recommend that you kind of plant your first beans in 1 week, and then your next beans a week later. And that would be a succession planting to keep your beans looking fresh if you're trying to do have beans, all the way until the end of the summer.
Right. So I get that. Yes. Like, so you wouldn't have, if you had a large area of beans and you didn't want all these beans at once, if you did the succession, then you could have like a weekly harvest instead.
Yeah. And you can, and that will help you, keep your beans coming, and because they will peak, but you still want to have some, at least throughout the bulk of the summer. Yeah. Next slide, please.
Would you apply that to cucumbers as well?
I would. And you can also do that to it. It wouldn't make sense to do it with something like a winter squash, because you know that you're going to be harvesting those all in the winter season. It doesn't make sense to do that with tomatoes as well, because they just come, during the tomato season. But with things that normally starts to peter out towards the end of the summer, it's nice to space those things out. So like your summer squash, you could do that with. Plant some this week, plant some the next week. With your cucumbers, you can also do that with as well. It really all depends on the growth of the plant. So farmers might do that a little bit differently, just because they understand that certain plants peak at different times and they start to peter out. With flowers, just real straightforward notes with flowers. In general, just go with the recommended planting seeds every 12 to 16, 2 seeds every 12 to 16 inches. And you want to be mindful of deadheading, where that's just the process of removing spent flowers, and that will encourage more flowers to grow throughout the season. With sunflowers, I do want to note that you want to make sure that you, with sunflowers, understand how tall they can get. and you want to be mindful of where that shade that they cast will be. So you don't want to plant your sunflowers where you have and right in front of other plants that would need the sun. So just be mindful of that. And yeah, just quick notes with the flowers. Next slide, please. All right, so getting into our transplants. So for those who grew out their own transplants, many of them were started in the month of March, and you can kind of see now that they're really ready to get out now that it's the month of May. I recommend that you hold off on planting your tomatoes and such. If you're planting them directly outside, the next week is going to be pretty cold. Somewhere around 40, around in the 40s if you have your own transplants. I recommend just holding off on that. And one other note that I do want to make related to the climate. So if you remember last year, super wet. Some people planted out their plants a little bit early and they got kind of suffocated by all the water within the soil. And so, if you plant your plant and you know that it's just too wet out there for your plant, and you see that your plant is starting to yellow because it's suffocating some, don't hesitate to dig that plant out and take it back inside and wait for that water to dry out if we do get a big rain in the early stages of the plant's life. So if something happens, late May or sometime in June, where it's just too much water out there for them, and it's still in the early stages, like you just planted your tomato plant that you got from us, gauge how much water is going to be coming down. If it's like, a ton of inches that are coming down, be ready to, make that decision and save your plant. If you think that your plant can make it through, just think about that. Because there were, a lot of plants that were lost just because there was a lot of rain that came down during the early season. But just a note, something to think about as we're experiencing more rain. All right. So we have a lot of nightshades and some herbs and some watermelon transplants that we're giving out this year. New to this list is sage. That's the new herb that's rotating out our oregano from last year. So next slide, please. Let's see what time it is. All right, we can get on time. All right, so our Nightshade family, that includes our tomatoes, our peppers, our eggplants, tomatillos, and ground cherries. These are all heavy feeders, so add your amendments, add your compost before planting. Make sure that your soil is ready for those plants. And also with your crop rotation, you want to make sure that your tomato plants weren't planted in that same area as the previous year. If you have the the capacity, make sure that you're rotating your plants. Tomato plants, we recommend that they're planted at least 2 feet apart. Trellising is a must. Use tomato cages or the basket weaving method, and utilize your tomato stakes as well. One simple trick that you can do to encourage the growth of a tomato is, I'm gonna draw this out. So when you're planting your tomato, what's special about the tomato plant is that if buried, and I don't know if people can see my screen, if buried, so let's say this is our tomato plant here, and let's say you got your tomato plant and you bury about half of it under the soil, and sometimes you can make it curve like so, that stem is going to transform it, or it's gonna start to transform into more roots for that plant. And so that's a great way to encourage more roots for the plant, so that nutrients are taken up, and that growth is emphasized and also easier for that plant. Instead of just you got your transplant and here's the root ball, and you're just going to plant it right there with the soil. Your plant is still going to do fine, but with tomato plants, and just specifically tomato plants, not something you should do with other plants. You can just plant your stem about halfway down, and your plant will still do well. And those roots will, that stem will transform into roots. And another thing to promote more fruiting and easier management is suckering off your tomato plants. Suckering is something that you should strive to do for your tomatoes, because it is going to help increase that airflow, and which will help with disease management, but it will also help promote better fruiting for your tomato plant. Now, if you forget to, sucker your tomatoes, it's tomatoes will still grow, your plant will do okay. But if you want a plant that's, working for you, it's recommended that you do suckering, at least once or twice a week, if you can. And if you are training your tomatoes, try to only keep 2 liters on your plants. Some other styles might have you do 3 liters or just 1, but 2 liters, meaning that you just let a sucker grow until it's growing alongside the original liter. So you got your liter, and then your sucker will start to grow, and then you will just have to plant. And you want to train your plant to do that early. So I recommend that you look up training your tomatoes. And here I can also draw that as well to kind of help show that. And we do have some volunteer hours posted on the farm. We do have limited spacing, but we do have some tomatoes planted at the farm. So if you all come out and volunteer, I'll be happy to show you while you're volunteering what suckering and training tomatoes look like if you're able to come out. Here, Kiyoki, post the volunteer link if you have the link.
I can try.
Yeah, I have to text Lynn to get that from her, but or maybe I can forward it to you. But as your tomato is growing, and let's say this is the leader here, and here are the leaves. These are just normal stems that are shooting out. Your suckers are going to be like right in between that stem and the leader. And so the suckers have the potential to become leaders. And it's recommended that you let a sucker grow out so that it's right there with that leader plant. And then you continue to take off other suckers so that you have ultimately 2 vines that are growing out of the plant. And so you're still doing your management of suckering and such, and then you just got your plant and the normal vines that grow out, and that's gonna be ideal for tomato production.
Kelly, I pulled up a Google image, just maybe if you want to reference it. I'm going to screen share it.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. So in this picture, the big picture on the right side, so that's a tomato that's only 1 liter. Okay, so that's a 1 liter tomato right there. Now in production, we do 2 liters. Sometimes you might see 3, but that means that they let these suckers over here grow, to the same size as the liter, and let it grow alongside the liter at the
They're
earlier
calling
stage.
the growing tip here, or like part of the growing tip.
Yes, so like you want that sucker to be right up there with the growing tip, so that you have 2 liters. Yeah, and then for other suckers, since they have the potential to become leaders and kind of throw off the growth of a plant, throw off the growth of the tomato plant, you want to take those off, because that means that that tomato plant is now focused on its vegetative growth and not its fruiting growth. So if you let suckers just grow, that means that tomato plant is just focused on growing more leaves, growing more stems. You need to control those suckers so that your tomato plant is focused on only growing those 2 liters, but then also focusing on that tomato production growth. Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't. Yeah, let's get back to the slide. Thank you, Keto. Okay. We'll talk about the pests that you commonly see and the diseases that you commonly see on the nightshades in a bit. With peppers, they can be also spaced to 18 to 2 feet apart. I recommend that you stake your peppers, kind of put a wood stake right next to it and tie the pepper plant along with it so that it's a bit more stable. Pepper plants, they don't really, even though they grow up straight up, they can sometimes overfruit, and the fruit can cause that plant to lean over some a bit more. So staking is almost necessary for pepper plants. One thing that you also want to be mindful of as your pepper plants are growing, you want to be mindful of the canopy that pepper plant is developing. So those leaves and how they shade out the plant. If your pepper plant doesn't shade the fruit, the pepper fruit, something called scalding can happen, where the sun is just directly on that pepper plant and it's causing it to kind of burn out. And thus you have a pepper plant that you can't sell. I mean, you can still eat it, you just have to cut up around it. But it's an imperfect pepper plant, because the canopy of that pepper plant didn't shade the plant all the way. And so if you see scalding happening to your pepper plants, I recommend that you put up some type of shade cloth over your plant so that you can help that plant shade out the sun some. And your pepper plants will still grow if you're using the correct shade cloth, something that I don't know the percents yet, but on top of my head of like how much a percent sun you need to block out so that your plants, pepper plants, grow correctly. But
can I clarify a little bit? You're talking about fruit, not scalding the fruit.
No, the fruit, the fruit that we eat, if that's exposed to the sunlight too often, it will start to have a blemish, which will scald. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. You were saying pepper plant, and you're.
Oh,
it's good. It's good.
And so, if you see that happening consistently, how to address that? You put up a type of shade cloth, something to help block out some of the sun from on top of your plant. Okay. Now, when your pepper plant is ready for harvest, they can either be harvested when they're green or red. To get them to turn red, it kind of needs to be consistently over 80 degrees or so during the day. And that fruit needs to be on there longer on the vine. But when your plant is ready for harvest, what you want to do to check it is by just squeezing it some, and you will kind of hear a bit of a cracking. So when your pepper plant is firm, that means that plant is ready for harvest. And that's going to be for your bell peppers and your kind of larger peppers. For peppers that are skinnier, like your jalapenos and your cayenne peppers, that's really going to be based off the length for the cayenne peppers. And there's also another method called checking, where you start to see brown streaks on some of your pepper plant. And so when you start to see those streaks of brown just around it, that also means that your pepper plant is ready for harvest as well. But for those bigger plants, you want to check, see how firm they are. For the cayennes, sometimes it's also based on the color of that plant as well, once the color's changed. If you see a color change from green to red, yellow, if you see a yellow or red plant, that means that it's definitely ready for harvest. Sometimes you can also see a plant that's green and red at the same time. So for that, you might want to just give it a little bit more time for it to turn red or full color. And then for harvesting both of tomatoes and peppers, you can use your hand, but it's also recommended that you use clippers or scissors and cut them off at the tip. Eggplant can be planted 18 to 2 inches apart. And eggplants, they don't need to be trellised. They're really, really strong, sturdy plants once they get going. And when they're ready for harvest, I like to use the method of, along with the size of the eggplant. You want to look at your eggplant, and you can sometimes see, if it's like really shiny where you can like almost see your reflection on it. And that's a sign that that plant is immature and not quite ready for harvest yet. Now, when you look at an eggplant that's ready for harvest, it's going to be a bit more blurrier, more opaque. You won't be able to really see yourself. You kind of be blurry. That's along with the ideal size that you want. That eggplant is going to be ready for harvest. And then for harvesting, you want to use clippers, and also be mindful, eggplant are spiky around this green part here on the picture screen. So be mindful of that. And you just want to cut them off at the tip and leave that green part attached to your eggplant. All right. The tomatillos, 18 inches apart. And also they do get wild in parentheses here. Tomatillos are a really straightforward plant that take care of themselves. Just make sure that they're spaced properly apart from each other. For harvesting those, you want to wait for that kind of paper wrap around the tomatillo to break open some. And that means that your tomatillo is going to be ready for harvest. You can also wait a little bit more for that tomatillo to get bigger. But once that paper wrapping kind of breaks open some and you can see the tomatillo protruding from it, it's ready for harvest. Ground cherries, another really straightforward plant, 18 inches apart. Ground cherries, it's in the name. When those ground cherries fall on the ground, you normally see them be kind of, when the plant grows, it's green in the paper wrapping, just like it's not paper, but it's plant matter, but kind of looks like paper. It's wrapping around that plant. And so when it's ready for harvest, before it's ready for harvest, you see that it's kind of green. And then when it starts to deepen in color, turn orange, kind of yellow some, that's when it's ready for harvest. And then also that wrapping around it turns brown as well. And also you can really taste, it's easy to taste when a ground cherry is ready. If you've had the pleasure of tasting a ripe ground cherry, it's quite the experience. But when a ground cherry isn't ready, it's, you know, super sour. When it's ready, it's very sweet and it just tastes amazing. Yeah.
So there's a couple questions here.
Yeah.
You don't have to talk about it now, but at some point, if you could talk about four-legged pests.
Four-legged pest,
and
animals.
particularly if there's anything not using fencing, but any kind of deterrence. And then specifically related to nightshades, you know, should you shade out the fruit on tomatoes?
So let's start with that. You don't have to shade out the fruit on tomatoes. Let me talk about harvesting with tomatoes. I kind of skipped over that. So with the tomatoes, for harvesting with those, you ideally want those to be in full sun. But for tomatoes, all tomatoes, you can, let's talk about, there's different types of tomatoes. So you have your heirloom tomatoes, your cherry tomatoes, your paste tomatoes. With the heirloom tomatoes, well, with all tomatoes, I would say, you can still harvest those early, meaning that when you see that your tomato is about 50% green and 50% yellow or red, whichever color is going to change, that means that your tomato is in that in the brushing stage, where that means that you can harvest that tomato and have it finish ripening off the vine. And so typically, if you're like in you know that you want to get that tomato a little bit early, just look for, if it's 50% red and 50% green, you can harvest it early. Now, if you're trying to harvest your tomatoes when they're, you know, still on the vine and they're ripe on the vine, you just kind of want to give them a little squeeze some, see if they're a little bit squishy, a little bit firm. I like to harvest my full tomatoes when they're full color tomatoes when they're firm and full in color. And that's for like a fully ripened tomato on the vine. You want to squeeze it, see how firm it is, and then you want to clip it off. When you're harvesting your tomatoes for storage, you want to, for the heirloom ones, you want to flip them over. And this is good for those tomatoes that are still ripening. Flip them over and let them sit upside down. That's going to help them ripen fuller and quicker. For cherry tomatoes, kind of similar to the same process. You want to look for that color change of 50%. And with the Roma tomatoes, it's very much the same process where you start to see that color change somewhere around 50%, and then you can harvest it anytime after that period. If you do harvest it early, make sure that you give them time to fully ripen. A couple of notes with harvesting. You want to make sure that you don't harvest when it's raining, because of disease, the ability to spread diseases more easily if you have them. So don't harvest your fruiting crops like your tomatoes and such when it's raining. You only want to harvest those when it's dry out, preferably. And also with the tomatoes, especially those heirloom tomatoes, you want to be mindful of the rain, because if you do have a ripe tomato on the vine already and it's going to rain and it rains, you might come out the next day and see that your tomato has split. You normally see splitting tomatoes when they're getting a lot of water and they're still on the vine. And that's just because, you know, the water has nowhere else to go on that fruit crop. So it just comes out the tomato. And sometimes that can split and cause imperfections in that tomato. And so if you know that there's a rain about to happen, try to come out before the rain to harvest your tomatoes and such. And so for also for keeping your garden tidy, you know, peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, they fruit a lot. And tomatoes specifically, you know, you can miss a lot of harvest and those tomatoes can end up on the ground. And that can be a attractor for pests to come because they smell those rotting tomatoes and such. So you want to make sure that you stay tidy with your harvesting and also keeping your you know, your garden clear of plant matter and fruit matter, so that you're not attracting pests to that. You know, typically, you know, a pest or such, you know, an animal is coming to eat a ripe crop. You know, they're ideally waiting for that right time to eat a tomato plant. And so one strategy could be utilizing that method of harvesting that tomato a little bit earlier and letting it ripen in a safe location if you can. And also with pests and such, you know, some crops do fail. And so you can kind of see a rotting crop on the vine or a rotting tomato on the vine or pepper. And so if you see that, I recommend that you just cut off that plant and put that in the compost directly because that can be a attractor of, you know, pests and such. So always check your plants, go through, check them out. And so that's like a big deterrent for animals, making sure that they don't, you know, smell that rotting crop and making sure that you're keeping your garden tidy and on top of your harvest. So let's continue on with pest. So, and can you go to the pictures that we have in the next slide as well? All right, so your tomato hornworm, you'll commonly see this on tomatoes. You might see it on peppers as well. I haven't seen it on the eggplants, but I'm sure it's possible. It's its favorite crop are those solanums. And it's seeded by a moth that comes in and seeds the tomato plant. And sometimes it's hard to spot because it is green. So what you have to do is look for the damage. Seeing eaten up leaves, some chewed up stems sometimes, and eaten tomatoes. You know, you got to question and be out there on the lookout for the signs of damage because, you know, you don't normally see the culprit first, but you can definitely see the signs first. And a simple way to handle this plant once you spot it, it's, you know, it might look frightening, but it is not frightening to deal with. You can just pick it off and, you know, you can leave it out, you know, throw it out, leave it for the birds or such. But once you remove it from your tomato plant and, you know, take it far away, it's not causing any issues. Something that's also fun to see, sometimes you might see some white seeds on top of this tomato hornworm. That means that a beneficial insect has a beneficial parasite has laid its eggs on top of that plant, and thus that's a good sign of meaning that tomato hornworm has been taken care of for you by a beneficial pest. So that's just a normal, very cool thing to see.
I'm going to show that real quick.
Yeah. Yeah, we saw that a couple of times last year, Keto.
Yeah.
So that doesn't mean that your tomato hornworm is transforming or anything. That means that it's being eaten, basically. Yeah, and you can just leave it on the vine from there and let nature take its course. Yeah, but let's see if the name. Yeah, those are things laid by a wasp. All right, next slide, please. So the flea beetles. So let me just backtrack a little bit. The tomato hornworm that flies in, so they don't overwinter. It's from a moth from that just blows in, each summer. The flea beetles, on the other hand, are they live within the debris of plants that they infested from last year, and then they just come up, and then they just start to eat if they're there. Especially if the plants that they like are planted right on top of where they were last year. So crop rotation is good for that, and also taking care of your plant matter from last season will help address that issue. Also, one thing to note for a lot of plant, insects that overwinter, they normally look for certain temperatures, temperature consistencies called degree days to start to become active. So that's pretty much their dormancy mechanism of not hatching during the winter. And so you will start to see more and more flea beetles as the temperature starts to pick up. So be mindful of that. As the temperature starts to pick up, you're going to start to see different type of insects that you normally see active. As a gardener, as a farmer, that's kind of like your grace period, if you ask me, to get ready for them, because they do come. So get ready for them by doing crop rotation, but also doing that in combination of using remay or some type of cover on top of your eggplants or crops that are normally affected by flea beetles. Some other things that are affected by flea beetles are brassicas. I typically see them on brassicas, being your broccoli, kale, collards, and such, but I typically see them on top of the bok choy plants. So using crop rotation, moving them to a different area where they don't normally grow up from, and also using remay as a remedial, foundational things that you can do beforehand before they become a problem. And if they are a super, super huge problem, you can use that diatomaceous insecticidal powder, and you just sprinkle that on top of your plants. And because they have a exoskeleton, they're affected by that, and it's very effective against them. And so flea beetles, if you see that your plants are kind of wholly, not totally eaten out, but you can kind of see some holes, that is a telltale sign that you have flea beetles. And of course, if you see some black dots on your plants and you move to touch them and they jump away, that is a flea beetle. That is a flea beetle. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, your aphids. So aphids.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's just a picture of aphids. Aphids, they come in, they're really translucent. Sometimes they're green, sometimes they're red, yellow, black, gray-ish. And so they feed on the sap of your plants. They really like to feed towards the growing points on your plants. So like your flowers, the tip of your stems, the in-betweens of your stems, that's where you'll commonly find them. And for transplant production, you normally see them on younger plants, and that's when they're really effective. They're really effective and dangerous for younger plants, because younger plants just don't have the energy to deal with them and also grow at the same time. So that's when they can really affect the growth of a plant. And if they're at this stage of like an infestation, they can even do damage to a adolescent transplant or plant that's in the garden. And depending on the amount of aphids that you have, maybe 5 or so aphids, I'm gonna just take care of that by just hand picking them or such. But if you have an infestation, you might have to use something a bit more stronger and a bit more, easier to apply. Next slide, please. All right, so a little bit about aphids. So aphids, they don't overwinter. They can't make it through winter here. They fly in typically with the warm weather. And so, observation I made was a little bit warmer this season. And so we got aphids a bit more earlier. So kind of, some pests just move with the flow of the temperature. Those are not exactly degree days at work, but it's warm for those plants and they just get active. So treatment for aphids, a strong blast of water. And let me start by saying, the sooner you address the aphid issue, the easier it's going to be, because you don't want to wait for, a ton of aphids to get on your plants for you to see that they're an issue. They multiply really, really quickly. That's because they're asexual. And so they're kind of like a raspberry plant where you can just, and so you want to get on top of them as soon as possible. And if you see one aphid, that means that you got two aphids somewhere, right? And so, like, for example, if you got some transplants that have some aphids on them, you want to just take care of them and squish them, or, spray them down with water just to take care of them. A couple more things that you can do you can do a non-detergent soil water solution. You go to the aphid slide for me again, Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to write in the chat and I'm having issues. Okay.
Sorry. A simple mix that you can use. You can use a non-detergent soap with 1/2 teaspoon of cayenne pepper and a pint of water and just a spray bottle, and put that on top of your plants. And that's something you can apply to your plants, every 2 to 3 days until you're sure you don't have any aphids. Another solution is using a water solution of neem oil and spraying that on top of your plants. That's a organic option you can use. And then something that is a bit more stronger, also organic, you can use the safer insecticidal soap. And we use neem oil and the safer insecticidal soap on the farm. And typically I'm applying every 1 to 2 days, just to make sure that I'm keeping that pest pressure down. And you want to try, insects are very smart. So you normally see them under your plants where you might not be able to exactly spray on them, but you want to try and do your best to get in those areas where you know where they're going to be. And what else do I want to say? And one thing that I saw while I was, doing transplant management and, just working on my plants. Oh, thank you for posting that, Keto. Birds are an excellent friend to have on the farm. They love insects, and I got to see some, the little little itty bitty birds, come and eat the aphids right off of the transplants. So they have been a great help, along with the neem oil and such.
The ones that have been flying around the greenhouse.
Oh yeah, yep.
Nice. That's great.
I'm like, awesome.
Maybe finches? I'm not sure.
I think those are them. The little gray brown ones. I mean, the brown one. Yeah. Yeah. So birds are an excellent, natural predator for aphids. Also, another one are ladybugs. The ladybugs that you see that are the normal ones that with the round shell. Those are the adult ladybugs. The adult ladybugs don't really eat the aphids, but their younger versions eat the aphids. If you can pull a picture up of those.
I'm sorry, what, of what?
Can you pull a picture up of the adolescent stage of an aphid, Keto?
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's see. Let's also make sure we talk about seed saving with the Solanum crops. So it's really easy to do seed saving with fruiting crops because the seed is gonna be right in there in that fruit, right? And so like with peppers, the winter squash, the tomatillos, like as soon as you got that plant with the peppers, they're ready. When that pepper is, nice and firm, those seeds are ready. Well, I do recommend that you let that particular pepper plant just go a little bit longer. Let those crops go a little bit longer, and then those seeds will be ready for harvest. The only ones that are a bit more involved are the cucumbers and the tomatoes. So the seeds from a cucumber and a tomato, they're kind of wrapped in a pulp, which protects that seed from germinating early. And that's just a dormancy mechanism that you need to address through fermentation. And that process just looks like taking, those seeds, scooping them out, and then just putting them inside of a cup and letting them just sit in themselves, add a little bit of water, and let them sit there for a couple of days, mix it up some, and you'll start to see that pulp that was wrapped around that seed start to dissolve some and naturally come off and move to the top. It's going to be nice and stinky, but that's a good sign. And then once all those pulp seeds are away from that plant, then you just want to strain it out and separate it in some type of manner, and then you just got your seed. But that's like the process of fermentating your tomato seeds and your cucumber seeds. Those are the only seeds that you have to do those with typical vegetable crops. The rest of the seeds that we give out, the rest of the plants and seeds that we give out in the distribution, seed saving, for those, you just have to let them go a little bit longer, and then they're ready for usage. Let's see.
I'm not sure if I did the right thing, but here's what I found for aphid life stages.
Oh, aphid life stages. Oh, the ladybug life stages.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, yes, the larva of a ladybug, that's the stage where they eat the eat the aphids. So if you see that, that's not just a bug that's eating your plant. That's a beneficial insect that's helping you out.
Here, let's find a better picture. Okay.
And there's one with some aphids right by it.
So it's not the adult.
It's not the adult. Yeah. But I mean, if you see the adult, that's also a good sign as well. But typically, it's just since people aren't familiar with this stage of the ladybug, they might think that it's just a pest that's on their plant.
Yeah, for real.
But we got a little bit more slides. Those are just a list of beneficial insects to be on the lookout. I'm sure you all will be receiving this slide. We're just going to speed through this. Just things that you want to have in mind, and I believe this is the last one. So just quickly, for parsley, for our herbs, parsley, the whole plant is edible, maybe even the roots. Spacing 12 to 18 inches, depending on how much space you have. You want to give those plants a little bit of time before you start harvesting them. And then from there, you can just harvest it as needed. And parsley, you can help it get through the winter by covering it up with leaves and mulch and helping it overwinter. Probably right now, if you did that sometime around May, will be a good time to uncover it. Maybe even April, late April, depending. With basil, the basil, the leaves and the flowers are edible, and also the seeds. I would add. The seeds are something that are really cool to see. If you let your basil plants go to seed and you sprinkle some water on it, you'll start to see the seeds become kind of covered in some type of jello, which is just the seed. But yeah, getting back on topic. So you also want to allow this plant to have some time before you start to harvest from it. You want to make sure that it has at least 6 to 8 leaves before you start to pull your plants from it. One thing that you do want to be on the lookout is your basil seed starting to flower. When your basil seed starts to flower, that means that it's not going to put energy into making the leaves taste good. So it's always good to prune off those flowers before they start to form. And one sign that you know that your basil is kind of getting done is when it starts to become gray some, or it gets powdery mildew or such. So you do want to be careful with your watering and make sure that your basil has airflow and that you're harvesting it in a way where air can pass through and keep diseases under control. One thing to note when you're harvesting your basil, you want to make sure that those harvested leaves and stems, you want to make sure that your leaves don't get wet after you harvest it, because that will kind of speed up the decaying process. So you just want to make sure that just the stem gets water if you're doing that method of cutting off the plant and putting it in water. Make sure that the leaves don't get wet. With sage, every single part, but the root is edible. So the stems are edible as well. They're very pungent with the sage smell. Spacing is 12 to 18 inches apart. And the only special note with sage is that it is a perennial, so it will make it through the winter. You just want to prune it back each spring. And when you're harvesting, you also want to be mindful of how you're cutting your sage plant so that you're just not cutting off too much of it unevenly. And yeah, I believe that is it.
All right.
Open it up for questions or clarification.
Yeah. So there's one question here. What brand of insecticidal soap do you like?
So, what is that brand called?
Safer soap? Was that it?
The Safer soap brand. I believe that's like the main one that we stick with. I'll have to look up the exact name.
I just want to make one note for folks, and I didn't mention it earlier, but in the future, when you're talking in the chat, there's an option to write directly to me or if you want to chat to the group, and it's nicer to chat to the group so they could see the questions. Well, we got a minute here, so we got a few minutes left. So I think if you'd like, we can open it up. If you want to unmute and ask questions, or if you want to continue to add them to the chat, that's fine, and I can share them to the group for us to talk through. But we're open it up. Let's talk about any questions you might have about growing hot crops. Okay. From earlier, oh yeah, the four-legged pests. Thank you, Lawrence.
Yeah. So
Any recommendations how to keep animals, squirrels, etc., out of the garden without erecting barriers?
my main suggestion is that you stay on top of your harvest. Don't let plants go to rot in your field. You don't want that smell to be out there for the pests to know that they're there. That is like the main thing in keeping those pests away.
So for squirrels,
Mhm.
I mean, if you don't mind, I'll just add, squirrels are difficult. Squirrels, clearly can get anywhere in the garden, and they have a strong ability to climb. There are some repellents on the market, and that's what she was asking about directly. Did reiterate that. There's one that's called Plant Skid. I'm gonna put it in the chat. It's kind of spelled funky, which is like made of animal urine, like goat urine or something, or coyote urine or something. That has some effectiveness, that make that it's a scent of a predator. Yeah, I mean, squirrels are really difficult, honestly. But yeah, that would be one to start with. Okay, going on the list. Can basil be preserved over the winter as well as parsley?
Basil, no, it does not do well. It really starts to peter out in October. It cannot take the winter at all.
So Jessica's saying, for raccoons, also with the repellents, I would say yes, that you can try something like the plant skid. And then there's a question about like when I have, or just a statement, when I have an overabundance of basil, I just cut and dehydrate or chop it, mix it with butter to use for later. Awesome. Okay, I had a beetle that was devouring leaves on my green bean plants last year. What can I do if I see them this year?
Was it a Japanese beetle, or more description about the beetle?
Yeah, can you give any more detail, Juanita?
Identification is the first step to pest management.
So I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Hi, my name is Joy. Last year I was growing tomatoes, and pretty much all of my other tomato plants were doing really well, except for this one. And every time, the fruit would look good as it was growing on the vine. And then right before harvesting, the bottom would just turn black. And so, of course, I would pick that one off, and throw it away. But it kept doing it. I mean, I wasn't able to harvest not one tomato from that plant. And I did the same thing that I did for all the other plants. It was in the same soil.
Yeah. So that is called blossom end rot, and thank you for the question. So blossom end rot, that is from a calcium deficiency within the soil. So that means that your tomato is not getting enough of that. And so to directly address that, you want to add gypsum. Gypsum is a amendment, soil amendment. And so, basically just take a cup of gypsum, mix it in some water, really get it nice and mixy. You want to get it nice and dissolved within that water. And then you want to, apply some of that to plants.
Can
Okay.
I,
And so you normally see blossom end rot happen on your bigger tomatoes. I haven't really seen it on cherry tomatoes. You definitely see it on Romas, and you can see it on some of your heirloom tomatoes. But you want to
Yeah.
apply that before before your plants start to fruit.
Okay.
can I add one more like
Yeah.
layer to that is to look to, I mean, we recommend everybody get a soil test. So a soil test is going to help with that on some level because
Okay.
the soil test will tell you where you're at with calcium in your soil.
Okay.
And the other piece of that puzzle is consistent water. So water in the is if you're not having a consistent watering, you don't want to water tomatoes too much, but water is what helps the calcium travel into the plant.
Mhm.
So that would be another layer. So addition to what Akela said about gypsum.
Can I
Okay,
make a
thank
comment
you.
about? Yeah, can I make a comment about the beetle that was eating my green? Well, the green beans were along, but it was just eating the leaves. And so what I
Okay.
did when I finished with the last crop, I dug up the ground and I sprinkled it with the Demetrius soil, real good, because I thought it
Uh-huh.
might have shell, a skeletal shell. It was a kind of a yellow and brown beetle.
Brown beetle.
Well, here's a let's try this.
Take a
Do any
picture.
of these look familiar?
Oh, that whoa, right there. You know what? Japanese beetle. I think that's was it.
Okay. Yeah. The Japanese beetle. That one can definitely get it likes a lot of different crops. It does. And so Japanese beetle, they overwinter within the soil. And so really crop rotation doesn't do much because they fly.
Oh,
And one thing that you can do though, because they do fly, and they do come out of the soil, you can plant your crops in a different area and also cover them with remay.
with what?
With remay or row cover, you're going to cover them with some type of breathable
Okay.
cover. And also neem oil spray is something that you can use on your
Can you
plants.
spell that? Neem?
NEEM.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and of course you want to be mindful of how many Japanese beetles you have out there. If you only see like just a couple and the damage isn't too bad, you want to be mindful that this is just if it's not too much, then it's okay.
Well, it was a lot last year. It was in
Yeah.
one bed, and,
Yeah.
and I was so like I couldn't get rid of them. I sprayed, with it. But so when the year ended, I just dug it up real good, and I sprinkled earth with the soil, that Demetrius soil. Did that help?
Well, that was the end of the season, or
Yeah, at the end of the season, when I
Yeah.
dug up the whole, bed, I sprinkled the
Yeah.
earth real good.
so it's to apply that properly, you want to apply that during the peak season of that insect's lives. So like if you're just sprinkling right on top, they're already in the soil, they're done for the season. So it's not going to be effective at that time. You want to do that and you want to make sure that it's not going to rain anytime soon as well. You want to do that while that insect is active.
Okay, I had one other question. I started growing a comfrey plant in a pot, 5-gallon container, and it started off real good, and then all of a sudden I see a couple of, I don't know, mold on a couple of the two of the largest leaves. I sprayed it with somebody said baking soda water. Does that help?
Well, it really all depends on the type of mold that it is, but did it help? Did you
stopped
see
it on one, and then the new growth, I don't see it yet, but I don't want it to spread to it. It's the mold is black, it's got
Well, know that if there's mold on one leaf of a plant, it's likely that it's, in that plant and how it will show. So, I mean, you can definitely, still try, just cutting off that entire leaf
Mhm.
and trying to separate it that way and still applying, neem oil or baking soda on that plant. And depending on how fungi show up, it's going to be different from plant to plant. They want to look up, fungi on comfrey plants so that you can identify it and properly address it.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Judy just made a comment that she using soapy water, you can like kind of flick Japanese beetles into a bucket or a bowl, and that works well for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are very they let you get close, which is something you can use to your advantage sometimes.
Yeah, well, last year my problem was I just they covered, I had about 6 plants and they just had a good time.
Yeah.
They multiplied and I said, forget it. I couldn't kill them. I just picked the last of the green beans and let it go.
I pulled up this slide just to give an image of what the row cover looks like to give you a sense of it.
Okay.
I have
Are
another.
there any other questions?
Yes, I have one other question. It's in regards to the I guess like little caterpillars, or so you know how you have they're the little
The
green
green
little
caterpillars?
yeah, but the little green little butterflies and they're leaving. However, whatever it was, I think it was one of those. And so I know, are they actually pollinators? Because I had so many that they ate all my broccoli. And I was going out there picking off the little, they blend in with the leaves so well. The little,
Yeah, those are cabbage loopers, and
yeah, those. They weren't
So
aphids.
yeah, to answer your question about those, I mean, they're not butterflies, those are moths. And
Okay.
those green worms, those are the cabbage looper worms, or one of those worms that really like brassicas. If you look up worms on brassicas, you will see pictures of them. And if that's what you're looking at, if you can pull up a picture of that. So those fly in each year. They don't feed. They don't overwinter here in Michigan. So one thing that you can do is cover your plants at the beginning of the season before they really start to get going, because they're going to be out here. I've already seen a couple of them, and you're talking to them. And so covering is a great way to address that. There's also a pesticide or organic pesticide that you can use called BT, which can be used on your plant.
How was that spelled? Yes, those right there.
So I just want to look up BT and look up pesticide. And it's really short for Bacillus something. But BT is the short name.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
BT, there you go. It's right there. Yeah. Thank you, Keto.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And so that's going to be like a something that you can use for, the worms that you see on your crops. It's effective.
Yeah. Okay.
Typically when you're going to be applying things like your fungicides or pesticides or your neem oil or things that you're going to be applying on your plants, you want to make sure that you're doing it when it's shady outside, so that whatever you're spraying doesn't dry up too quickly, and also when it's dry outside, so that your powders or whatnot don't get washed away.
Okay, so one other thing, is it okay or kind of recommended, so like as we're getting our transplants, so I picked up my cold crops And they said that they had a little bit of, an aphid problem, but it was not big. But I did see a couple of them. I thought I got most of them off, but I didn't. And so that's what I was doing. Is it okay to like pre-treat everything with like the neem oil, or is that not good, or just no?
The neem oil doesn't really deter aphids.
Okay.
Now, a pre-treatment, really all depends on what the pest is, but for neem oil, for aphids and such, really at that stage when the plant is young, it's okay. You just handpick the couple ones that you got, and you should be straight.
Right. Okay.
Now that second round, sometimes you can get those aphids, like if you've had Brussels sprouts, for example, or aphids in your broccoli, then you might have to come through, later in that plant's life cycle or a little bit earlier before the aphids become an issue and apply it again.
Okay.
But aphids, again, they fly in. So instead of applying something again, you can, plant your plant and put some type of cloth over,
Okay.
you have to fly out to get to your plant. So a barrier or something of that sort would help out.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's see.
Okay. Well, we are at 8 o'clock. Unless there's, we can take one last question, or we'll just go ahead and wrap things up. Okay. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for coming out. We'll see you at the next one. I will share out the link for the video and the slides via email with you guys after the fact, probably early next week. And hopefully we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all. Catch you at the next class.